really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello, this is Vikram Prakash, and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode, we have a conversation about architecture and design thinking, and we are trying to think about what architecture is today, what it has been in the past, and what it might be in the future. Today, I have here with me in my studio 3 young architects from Seattle, Cassie Blair, Tim Richey, and JoAnn Hindmarsh Wilcox, all of whom are the core part of the committee that's putting together the AIA Honor Awards this year. And I thought it'd be great to have a conversation with them, not to discuss the AIA Honor Awards, but to get a sense of where architectural thinking is in the city today. Welcome to Architecture Talk.
Thank you for inviting us.
Absolutely.
Indeed. Thank you.
Great. And I thought, I've been here about 20 years in Seattle, and I've seen the discourse of architecture in the city vacillate around questions of regionalism, critical regionalism, modernism, Northwest modernism, tectonics, and so on. These are the kind of things that come up in our academic discussions. And I'm wondering, perhaps starting with you, Tim, where discourse is going today. Now, I think you have been involved with the AIA Honor Awards for a number of years.
Yes, I think I'm going on 7 or 8 years. I sort of lost track at one point, but it's been several years.
So what do you think? What are the sort of changes you're starting to see or you're noticing in thinking around architecture in the city from your experience with the awards?
Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting is that I think I have now enough years, as many years as part of the Honor Awards Committee, that I can start to see changes in the sort of the styles of architecture that are being celebrated or being pursued more vigorously. Uh-huh. And you can't look at that from a year-to-year basis, but over several years, you can start to see a kind of a changing dynamic or sort of an evolution of where design and architecture in this region is going. And I can certainly recall in my first few years on the committee, there tended to be a greater focus on extremely expensive single-family homes.
Right.
And although we still get and have received every year of the Honor Awards many great single-family projects that are consistently awarded as part of this program, the character of those houses has tended to shift a little bit, and the way that the jury is seeing them has shifted. And so I think,
in what way? How's the character shifted?
I think that there's a little bit of a greater attention to kind of spatial character and craft, and less about sort of wealth and the richness of materials and details.
Spatial character and craft sound still very much like a investment in the ethics of regionalism. Would you still characterize the work as strongly dominated by that idea?
Yes, I think so. Yes. But also I think there's been a greater attention in the last several years of designers' ability to do more with less.
Uh-huh.
And I think we're seeing that, and I use the single-family residence as a sort of a vehicle for that transition, but I think it's happening really across all project types.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and maybe some of it has to do with the jurors. I'm sure it does, and the attitudes that the jurors bring as individuals to the program. But in some ways, that also reflects a changing mindset in architecture thinking.
So you're not talking about less is more as a sort of Misesian sense. Seems to me like you're trying to express something akin to a more minimalist ethic?
I think it's more about no, it's not the less is more in a Misesian way. It's more about finding and bringing out beauty in economy.
Right. I think that's interesting. JoAnn, but we are becoming a global city, aren't we?
Absolutely. I'm not sure if becoming or are. I think you can argue either, depending on either how long you've been here or what you think regional versus international looks like.
Right. I mean, there's a huge influx of people into the city. Sort of densification is certainly a big topic. We are worried about how to accommodate so many more people within the core fabric of the city rather than letting them get away into the suburbs. Do you see any impact all this has on architecture, its expression and its culture and its identity? Are you seeing any of this as a force?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's been a larger conversation about context, and not just context as a vehicle or a fabric with which you're responding, but really how can you begin to create context? Because often projects on a block are going up or being built at the same time.
Right. How
can you create community of context? How do you create context when there is none maybe to respond to, or when the response to that context is something which is not necessarily to do the same thing as was done before, but to really bring in hybrid programs. I'm really thinking about, the transition that I'm seeing architecturally, and this probably isn't a new conversation, but really thinking about function with regard to how can architecture create or incubate new types of functionalities within the context of both the urban environment, residential and commercial and retail. Certainly there are good examples of mixed-use development in our area, and there are examples that leave a bit to be desired.
Right.
Do you think that speed has something to do with that? That,
Absolutely.
Seattle has, over the last sort of 20 years, has been through several phases of high-intensity, super-fast development and growth that then kind of peters out, slows down a bit, goes through a period of with less development, less urbanization, less densification, and then it speeds up again. And I feel like we're in one of those really fast periods. But we were joking right before the podcast started about Fluffernutter. Fluffernutter, right? The whipped marshmallow that comes in a jar, right?
It tastes really good with peanut butter on bread.
Supposedly it tastes good with peanut butter. I wouldn't recommend it to adults. Kids love it, though. We were saying that when you get the jar down. So
you're saying local architecture is fluffer butter?
I don't know.
So let me see if I can make this analogy survive here. Well, when the jar goes down to 30%, JoAnn said, I think by experience, that you can put it in the microwave and it expands to fill 100% of the container again. Mm-hmm. It's the same 30% of nutrient density, but now it fills a greater volume, right?
I see.
So I think when we have those slow periods in the development in Seattle, it's a time when there's a little bit more experimentation. You have the same level of design nutrients spread out over a greater period of time, but it gives architects and designers and clients a chance to be a little bit more thoughtful, maybe a little bit more creative, a little bit more responsive when time and money isn't such an urgency to get things done quickly to meet a certain economic window in the city's development.
Right. Do you think there's a new emerging architectural vocabulary in the city over the last few years?
Well, there are definitely patterns and trends that we tend to see, and certainly having listened not only to jurors report back about what they see over and over again, the kind of, I'm not sure what the official term is, but the kind of L-shaped, broad parapet, patio kind of cap in modern infill housing, this L-shape, yes, is something that needs to be maybe rethought. And I think recently I heard someone say it's kind of the split level of the 2010s. It's certainly split level can be done very, very well, as can that architectural form. But it seems to be something that's repeated over and over again. And as a style or a critique of a style, I think think it came from a lot of the focus on interior-exterior connectivity, and really trying to then, create economical forms and kind of boxy shapes in a way that may not necessarily have been a trend in the past.
Yeah, well, I think about the acceleration of development that we're having now seems to have brought out fiber cement panels, 4x8 sheets of hardy panel, as the dominant material in
Seattle,
low scale Seattle.
Why? What do you think that is about?
Are you disagreeing, JoAnn, or are you shaking your head because you're disappointed with the results?
I am just thinking about how to phrase. What's interesting to me is that it has brought it out, both speed and economy, but there's some relationship that it has and responsibility that we have as not only a critique body and architecture body, but for codes and jurisdictions. And I think that there's a tendency in projects like what you're mentioning for the city essentially to have implied that for larger projects you need to break down the scale in a way that is actually quite unsuccessful in the way that architectures are either being asked or choosing to apply breaking down scale within the urban environment. And the panels are one of those pieces, that the kind of 4x8 sheet and this kind of innocuousness about how you either use it uncut or you cut it up, and therefore you're applying scale and differentiation. And you might see on the same building, right, in the same plane, that material applied a bunch of different ways, as if that somehow responds to the context or the scale. You can go further with color. Right. But it's interesting in that conversation of development and speed that we watching our neighbors that are experiencing developments at similar speed, Portland, for example, they seem to find a way in urban mixed-use retail environment to really create beautiful architecture that I think in Seattle, unfortunately, there's the exception to the rule rather than the rule. Yeah. I would love for mixed-use projects to really rise to the challenge of what it means to break down scale in a in a way that's going to create architecture that is responsive to the urban environment as well as the human body, but doesn't necessarily look like an applied finisher.
I think there's an international tyranny of big architecture. There's a lot of parts of the world where bigness is significantly celebrated, and one might argue that inversely there's a sort of a tyranny of the small in Seattle, and this imperative to break down and somehow connect that to some things. Now, Cassie, you have your master's degree was in history and theory, and earlier we were discussing that your thesis looked at the very fascinating work of Francesca Woodman and Gordon Marta Clark. And JoAnn just brought up the body, so I thought that's the perfect segue into your thinking. Working at AIA, what is your sense of the question of scale in Seattle, right? I mean, what do you think about this strong investment in the small scale, broken up building imperative that seems to be written into the city as it relates? Take it any way you want on the theoretical question of the body in the city.
Yeah, I have been back. I took a break from Seattle after my degree and lived in Nashville and just got back here in November. And so I think it's been interesting to see Seattle in a new light working at AIA. And so spending most of my days with architects. So maybe not speaking that language as much, but being an observer to a lot of the conversation that's happening. And so I think I'm going to answer the question by pulling in something that we talk a lot about too, which is advocacy in architecture. And so homelessness and density issues come up a lot. I hear questions about millennials a lot because I happen to fall into that generation, and there's a lot of talk about millennials wanting the micro housing, and they don't want roommates, and they don't like cooking anymore. And so I hear a lot of talk about what certain demographics and generations do or don't want from space, and how they function and use space, which I find to be maybe potentially true, but also untrue. And assuming that
what are the potentials of the millennial way of thinking from your perspective?
The potential truths?
No, not the potential truths. Just what do you think might be the implications of a millennial way of life on architecture in the city?
I think there's a great potential for less individualism and more communal and collaborative efforts. So that feels like a big discrepancy to me when I see the huge influx of microhousing, so much so that you go to find an apartment and you're really torn between whether you get a roommate to share a one bedroom or you spend a couple of $100 less and have 200 square feet on your own or something. So I find a potential lost opportunity in terms of really having conversations with a newer generation about how they might like to live and what that could mean for new developments and density in the urban core.
Right. So there's a constant debate in Seattle about the single-family character of the city versus potentially the need for a more microhousing, multi-family kind of character to the city. Are you suggesting that the millennial aspiration is not to automatically move into the single family and build a family there, and that there might be some other way to think about the city?
Yeah, absolutely. My understanding is that, or my perspective is that it's just not as binary as that. And I feel like the conversations happen in a really binary way, where it's about the single family value system and home, or it's about microhousing or multifamily that looks a specific way, and that those are sort of at odds. And I'm not sure.
What's the non-binary way to think about it?
I think the non-binary way to think about it, this might be a little idealistic or a little theoretical.
Go for
but
it. We are all about idealism.
Yeah, well, I think in an idealistic way, there would be a way to bring those seemingly opposing perspectives into the same room around the same table and have conversations about, I find at least that when I start talking to people and I am under the impression that we are very different, that I usually end up finding that we are more the same than different. And I think that that's kind of a larger parallel to things that are happening politically, obviously, and to diversity and embracing diversity in general. So I think that it would be interesting to have more conversations about what it could look like. Because I don't know that I have the answer or the suggestion, but design thinking is exactly that, is taking a problem and getting the right people around the table. And it's not just one perspective. It has to be a lot of perspectives.
JoAnn, any ideas on what a middle ground might be between microhousing and single-family housing as a vision for the city?
I think what's interesting is that, in Cassie's point, we are often more alike than we are different. And I would think that the thing that draws us to any housing situation, whether it's single-family or multifamily or microhousing, is more often than not the need for community or the development of connections between neighbors, between residents of either partners and residents that you're living with, and or reaching out to your neighborhood and or reaching out within your building. I mean, you look at a lot of models of housing that do start to bring those aspects, whether it's food or gathering or celebration, and out of either the single family home and or the multifamily, and create opportunities for people to live differently, almost like you would imagine some of the housing that's going on in University of Washington Housing and other colleges around the area, is really thinking about, what are the appropriate sizes of those communities? How can you create connections between people? And then how can we actually begin to bridge the gap of meeting your neighbors in doing that in a way that allows people of all generations, all diversity, to begin to understand each other, but also see each other as human beings. And that's actually really exciting. And I was sort of listening to you, Cassie, going, oh man, I have long dreamt of moving back into the city in a way because I'm missing that kind of immediacy and connection between neighbors. But then I think, well, I live in a neighborhood that actually is starting to generate that, whether it's the block out parties or, all sorts of different ways that can happen in both environments. And isn't there a way that we can look at housing differently, the way you would do urban planning and park planning? I
mean, I think it's an interesting thing that, for a long time I've felt in some ways Seattle architecture and Seattle as a city in general has always felt itself at the edges of the big centers of the world, whatever it is, New York, San Francisco, that we are kind of playing catch up. But in the recent, I'd say, decade and a half or so, it's starting to feel to me as if Seattle is, carving out its own identity as a leader of many ideas, we, whatever you want, diversity of sexual orientation, marijuana legislation, sort of new leadership in political environments, the resistance to Trump, whatever it is. There is a sort of a distinctive Seattle ethos, which is, coming forward, maybe even beginning back with Nirvana from the 80s or whatever. There's something to that, I think. Tim, do you think that translates itself to architecture and the city in any ways?
I think it starts to speak to the third place. The places that are in between the living environments and the work environments. And that it's in those third places. It's in those kind of community gathering spaces. It's in the cafe that opens out onto the street, or it's in the playground that integrates public art. Those are the places where people and communities and ideas, diversity of thought can come together. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I felt like there has been a time when development in Seattle was either creating empty places or not enough activated places. But the trend does seem to be swinging around now. We are seeing, I think, and maybe it's a product of the added density. There's more people concentrated in areas, and so that's kind of demanded a certain amount of new retail and new recreation space and new playgrounds and even new schools. That those gathering places that are best when they're designed, right? They're best when good ideas about architecture and urban planning are applied, can really serve those people and help a community grow, help a city grow and become more connected to the world. I think the idea of the public is a strong idea which is emerging out of Seattle, and how that connects to design as a way of producing the public rather than simply leftover space or simply an idea of planning policy is, I think, an emerging idea. We are having a conversation with Cassie Blair, who is at the AIA, JoAnn, who is with Malum, and Tim with SRG, discussing architecture and architectural design thinking in Seattle today, and we will continue after a short break.
This is Vikram Prakash, and you're listening to Architecture Talk, and we're in the middle of a conversation with JoAnn, Tim, and Cassie, 3 young architects in Seattle, and we are discussing the possibility of a third space, another space for architectural conversations in the city of Seattle.
I was actually going to tag on to what you were saying about the human kind of occupation in that third space. As I kind of see it as a unique Seattle outreach of our interior-exterior connectivity and the kind of romanticism of where that used to be about connecting to a vista or an environment. And really, in the new way of thought, we are applying the same thought process between inside-outside spatial connections, but to people, right? And the experience, it's not just people, it's experience. It's like crafting experiences, which for some reason in Seattle seem to be coming from a place of authentic ideal about getting people together and creating community, where other places experience could be something that's artificial or forced or right about a product or something. There's something about the way in which Seattle's applying that, and you see that in kind of the roughness of the materials, which are, again, an outreach of the kind of craft of regionalism, but the way they're being applied now are really thinking about the way in which things almost feel unfinished, and that the human perspective and that the occupant and the experience of that is in some way finishing that architecture.
I mean, I think it's very interesting you're replacing nature with people.
In a way.
I think that's an interesting idea, particularly given that Seattle is so strongly dominated by nature.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that when you think about Seattle in an urban condition, that kind of lack or void thereof could have turned into an architecture that's more insulated. But I think that application of, I don't know whether it's because you just can't beat summer in Seattle or, what it is about our environment from a physical sense, that connection between interior and exterior is so important in the way we practice architecture
But here you mean interior and exterior in terms of people.
I do.
It's not Frank Lloyd Wright.
No. That's why I think it's you can apply that to regionalism when you think about traditional Pacific Northwest architecture and kind of, even with the honor awards programs years past, the way in which that would have been read and interpreted by jurors is often, and can still be, about a connection between a romantic version of interior, exterior, just the environment itself. But I think that in the new way, when you look at urban projects and projects that are really successful in continuing that conversation, but on an urban scale, it's really about the connection of people, both inside and outside projects, paying attention to those third spaces, creating experiences where there can be opportunities for people to mix and mill and create community.
So that's pretty similar to what you were talking about earlier, Cassie, about the possibility of thinking a third space between the single family and the microhousing, right? I mean, one can say that the street and the community space is as emerging in Seattle a kind of a third space already.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the public space and the way that we're using third places, it's kind of an interstitial mediating point that creates a lot of interest, because this, not being from here, this is sort of a hard city to live in a lot of ways when you're thinking about weather, if it's new to you. And so I'm thinking about the body in space. I feel like some of that is just context. How do you behave when it's dark and rainy for X amount of months? And so I think that Seattle does a good job of tapping in. I think the built environment does a good job tapping into what keeps people kind of alive and sustained here. And I think a lot of that is through third places. A lot of it's through public spaces. A lot of it is through food and the connection to the earth and to the natural environment. I think it's through its history of, music and activism. And so I think there's just a larger historical context that the built environment, can and should really play off of and capitalize on.
But let's spend 1 minute on something you started off with. I also came to this city from outside. Perhaps most of us did. What did you mean by it's a hard city to get into? Tell us some of the 2-3 ways.
They're so cliche, but I think that...
Cliche is okay.
Cliche is okay. My personal experience was that socially it is... there's a lot of talk about community building, and I also really like that and I'm interested in that. I have been less clear in Seattle what that really looks like or how you really accomplish that. It feels like it's less incidental encounters. So my perception is that some of that is this larger kind of collective personality. If every city has a personality, I find that Seattle's is a little colder at first. So I'm interested in the ways that the built environment and design
Colder as compared to what?
Cold as compared to, for my personal narrative, I guess, like Colorado and also Tennessee.
Really?
So
we're colder than Tennessee. You don't mean that literally.
Cool. Well, I do not mean that literally. Yeah. I don't know. There was something about living in Nashville that the people... It's obviously not the place I chose to stay for a lot of reasons, but I think that there was something that felt... The public space is different, and the buildings are different, and the way that people interact is different. And so in that way, when we're talking about places that become more and more international, then I think that there's a greater responsibility to ask, what does community building look like in an inclusive way?
Is the city becoming warmer, Tim, do you think? Should it become warmer?
Maybe it's the same temperature. It's just more intense. I think that it's back to this kind of this idea of a city changing through population growth and density and an accelerated construction period. I think we're getting kind of through that design, through that development, and also just through the natural people getting closer together because there's more of us in a smaller space. It's getting warmer in that sense, but then there's some reluctance to change happening so quickly. That I think there's a lot of folks in Seattle that aren't ready for Seattle to be an international city. They think more provincially about it. They liked it when it was smaller. There's a nostalgia.
What do you think? What would you think? Is it good for us to become a much more international city and a different kind of a place? What is your feeling about this?
Personally, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think Seattle is becoming a much more interesting city as it becomes bigger and denser and more diverse. Before living in Seattle, I lived in London for 6 years, and London is a huge city.
Right.
It's I don't know, 6 million people or something.
It's too big, though, no? Would you say?
But it's big, but it's small. Everything in London is a small scale.
Right.
It's spread out and it's incredibly dense. And one of the things I'm always curious about when I go back to London is how many people are in every little nook and cranny of the city. You walk through, some areas of North Kensington and you turn the corner and you think, surely there's nobody here. Right. And there's a cafe that's got 60 people spilling out onto the sidewalk. And you think, how can a business like that survive? Right. How is there enough? How does anybody even know about it?
So you would love to double the number of people in Seattle.
Well, the difference is, Seattle I think that, proper. In a city like London, that's happened slowly over hundreds of years. Right. And in Seattle, as I was trying to say earlier, it seems to go through phases of kind of intense development and population growth, and then it slows down a bit. And each time it goes through one of those phases, the kind of character or the attention that certain aspects of development is given changes. Right. And I think that as mixed-use buildings are pushed into neighborhoods, it's changing the character of retail. It's changing the character of streetscapes and recreation spaces. In a lot of ways, I think there's improvement there. They're becoming more livable. People are, you're seeing people more often outside. The third place, so to speak, is becoming more visible and more active.
Right.
But I think there's also some resistance to that.
Yeah. Well, JoAnn, Amazon would love to, hire 100,000 more people and quickly move them into the city and take over and rebuild a lot of the fabric of our city. What do you think? Too fast? Too much?
Personally...
Yes, personally.
I come from a small town, and actually born locally, although my experience of summer was only in the summers, my kind of personal context. I knew Seattle in the summer only and spent my winters in another state. But I welcome it. And I think that might come from my experience in New York and other cities, but I think that it's all urban development comes with uncomfort, and change is hard, whether you're changing the color of your pants or you're changing the context of your housing or you're changing the kind of urban development of your city. But I think that the more voices and the more kind of social context we can build and that we can be open to, the richer the fabric of Seattle will get. Right. There are going to be growing pains. There will be places at which the uncomfort becomes uncomfortable, either architecturally or socially. But I think being open, I think what makes Seattle special, both architecturally and the way in which our city is responding to the kind of current context of what's happening in the world, is that through that the richness comes, and the embrace of the new is exciting to me, because it's not just new and different. That especially Amazon or other companies like that are bringing in voices that are multicultural. Right. They're bringing in voices that have different perspectives on value structures. And I think we all have a lot to learn from each other.
Right. Let's talk diversity, Cassie. It's not only the sort of millennials and the new Amazon and hires, but we also have a lot of influx of different people, particularly in the southern parts of the city. Obviously, diversity is important. We all talk about that. But do you think that's actually having a real impact on our city and its architecture and architectural culture? Or even can you speculate how it could have more impact?
I think you just mentioned that it's something that we talk about a lot. So that was a point I wanted to make, which is also a Seattle observation that I love, is that there's so much, I think, intellect and there's so much thinking and talking and discussing. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes there is a little bit of a lag time in terms of then what we do with that and the risks that we take, knowing that sometimes we might go wrong.
Do you think we are a risk-averse community?
I think in terms of action, quick action, yeah, I think...
Everybody's nodding.
I guess, and I'm thinking of some specific things. But yeah, like we're talking right now about doing at AIA through the Center for Architecture and Design with Design in Public. For 2018, we're thinking about an exhibit on sanctuary and thinking not only from the kind of the political definition, what does sanctuary mean, because we're a sanctuary city, but what is the greater meaning of sanctuary when we're thinking about diversity and what it feels like not only to live, but to really belong in a place and in space, and to have some agency within your built environment and within your home and within your public space and within your community. So I think I'm at the point where I'm still asking questions about that, because I'm not sure. There will obviously, be an effect, but I'm not sure what the difference is between saying that there's an openness to that and really carving out space for it.
Let's ponder on the word risk for a moment. I'm interested in each one of you briefly imagining, if you were able to, what's the risk you would like to see being taken here in terms of this, architecture, urbanism, and the built environment. What might be an interesting risk to take if you had free reign?
Who do I get to be in this scenario? Right. Am I an architect in this scenario?
Can we have multiple risks, just in case one risk doesn't really pan out?
You can go for
by the time you get to the end of it.
Throw 3 at the wall.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm thinking particularly as the architect, and I think that our role is unfortunately has been and continues to be serving the 1%. And or following the money. I mean, you can kind of voice it.
Always been true.
Correct. And kind of we are, we do serve at the whim of those that can afford. But I think the value of architects is really in our ability to apply design thinking to problems that are often outside of architecture. And I don't know if it's a risk that we should take as the city of Seattle, an urban place, but the risk we should take as architects is to engage in conversation and design problems outside of the built environment or our traditional realm of thinking.
You and mean really with banners and landscape, or beyond that?
So, for an example, around human health.
Right.
Really diving into the science of biology and neuroscience and really understanding, human health and the impact of the built environment around that, and applying design thinking to issues that we may not perceive on the outset are issues of architecture, like cancer. Yes. And I don't know exactly where that goes, but I think that as thought process, as thinkers, I don't want to say that word again, but as thinkers, the ability of the architect is to take in a wide variety of voices and create synthesis out of that. And that would be a risk that as architects to apply ourselves to, human health issues, to human social issues, to racial issues, and figure out what the voice of the architect is through installation, through public service, through advocacy, through the built environment, to bring architecture and the value of design to everyone, regardless of what they can pay. Because ultimately, as architects, bringing the value of design to those that might be new to the country but have voices and can bring design value will ultimately give us more interesting work, more complex work, and more thoughtful work that ultimately will come through in a lot of different ways.
I mean, I think design thinking as a concept has now reached broad acceptance, in business and other disciplines, in engineering. So I think this idea has currency.
I think it has, but it's still, I think it's, in what I see is it still lives in the realm of either business, economics, product design, industry design.
Right.
I really applying the idea of an architect participating in a research project with, I'm just going to use the example again of, cancer scientists.
Sure.
What could that provide, right? And even an architect entering into the conversation of, creating places for human health and really deeply understanding what that engagement process looks like. What does that look like as a role for architecture and architects, and as a risk that our profession in Seattle should take, given the unique social context and the ability for us to really be sanctuary city, to be on the edge of being able to really address some of these critical issues. I see that, we could have a reach. It might not be architectural, it might not be urban, but we could have a reach for humanity that's much further than just the boundaries of Seattle.
And that would also include inviting the Fred Hutch doctors and engineers into the architecture studio. What do you think, Tim?
I love that idea. And in fact, on every project that we start, we have a little brainstorming session within the team about who we can bring on as kind of a disruptor. And I know that term's become cliched and overused now, but it applies here, right? We're looking for someone outside of the architectural team, outside of the architecture as a profession, who can lend eyes and ears and a voice to a process that allows us as the design team, the creators of the process and the project, to break out of sort of these patterns that we fall into.
Examples? Can you give us an example of a disruptive intervention potentially happening around here?
We did a project recently where it was a competition. It was for an advanced manufacturing center. Mm-hmm. And we found a guy who used to work for Boeing, runs an advanced manufacturing plant himself, and he's in the industry, but he's well outside of kind of public architecture and funding and development and management process.
Right.
And maybe that's not a great example because he's still so connected by the theme of the project. Yeah. But because he wasn't, the traditional client or the traditional project management team or the traditional architecture and engineering team, he was able to see it from a new perspective, see how we worked and how we went about distilling ideas and asking questions. And often his voice and his input, just to break us out of routine in a way, helped us escape, the traps that we kind of create for ourselves to kind of repeat some of the things that we've done before. In some ways, that gets to this question about risk.
Yeah.
Right? Seattle and publicly funded Washington state projects are very risk averse.
Of course.
And have been for years.
Yeah.
And I think there is a challenge to, as you look over time, over decades, to push architecture into, to keep architecture current in that environment. Because there's that people want they want you to do something in the way that it's been done before.
So there are I guess there are good disruptions and bad disruptions. Yeah, but so what I'm saying is that we are seeing so much disruption all around us. Mm-hmm. It's a cliche because it's powerful in one sense, right? Mm-hmm. What are the sort of gateways or potentials for disruption in our industry? Any thoughts? From risk to disruption to...
The places I think we're seeing that most are they're private companies looking for an advantage in the marketplace.
Right.
And if you're hired by the state of Washington to deliver a project for a state university, for instance.
Like the University of Washington.
Like the University of Washington. There's a great example. There is a natural risk aversion, and it's smart because everyone has to be accountable for the money that's spent and the time that's spent and the product that is expected to live on for 100 years. But I've left myself wondering recently whether or not we're doing enough to push the boundaries of architecture, to use three-dimensional modeling tools to help with fabrication.
Right.
If that's the first time that an architect and a contracting team have done that, they're going to be averse to doing it.
Sure.
Even if, over time, it ends up paying off. It ends up bringing new horizons to the thinking about architecture and the possibilities in design.
So you would love to see, I think it'd be very interesting to see what the really disruptive implications of fabrication are on the industry. I think we're starting to see some of them, but they still seem to be occasional and sort of specific projects. But to see it at a large scale would be interesting.
For sure. And let's remember, it was promised maybe 15 years ago, and it still hasn't.
Still
quite
very slow.
happened.
Still very slow. But you're right. To a certain extent, the industry is slow to change in that sense. But the millennials are blamed for disrupting everything. So what do you think, Cassie?
Well, on the topic of disruption, we had a forum on future-ready building, disruptive technology, and data-driven design. And it was mind-blowing for me because we heard from a research scientist at Autodesk who came in from San Francisco and showed us an example of modeling where basically bubble diagrams and concept with certain parameters, probably code, was put in, and then generative design flashed the hundreds of possible iterations and there narrowed it down. And I think that that's scary on the one hand, and also, as a millennial, maybe on the outside, really exciting when you're talking about the capacity then that designers would have to move into other areas where I think we need designers, if it's not drawing all of the iterations of a potential floor plan.
Right.
So that's kind of one risk that I think that the profession should be willing to take sooner than later. And then the other thing is maybe just more related to policy. I think that we are really good at talking, and I would love to see people get into a room and grab all of the voices that need to be in the room and not leave. And all the money, there's so much money in the city and so many private companies that I think are willing to put money at certain issues. And I think that we should stay in the room until we have a plan for the unhoused to be housed and a better design solution for our density.
I think
it's possible.
So we're going to go talk to global health and the doctors. We're going to go talk to the fabrication people, and we're going to go look at all the data disruptors. I think those are all great places to start rethinking the future of architecture in Seattle. It was great talking to all of you. Thank you so much for being on Architecture Talk.
Thank you, Vikram.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. I'm Vikram Prakash, and our show's producer is Sadie Vechler. See you next time.